All right, we're recording. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah McAnulty. I run the Skype a Scientist program. I'm so glad that you're here because today we are going to be talking all about how plants protect rivers with scientist Amanda Stahl. Housekeeping. Tomorrow we are going to be talking about wildlife corridors. So that's like how animals can get around in places that humans are taking up a lot of space. And we're specifically going to be talking about cougars, and that's with another conservation biologist named Paul Byer. So join us for tomorrow, 1 p.m. for that. Otherwise, let's get into it. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So would you like to tell us just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you like it?
Sure. I'm a researcher. I'm at Washington State University in the US on the West Coast. I'm trained in ecology. So I'm an ecologist who has focused a lot on river systems and how important the plants are that grow next to rivers. I also work in forests and other settings. And I work a lot with maps. So taking different kinds of information that we can put into maps on computers, including pictures from satellites and pictures taken from drones, and try to help people make good decisions about where to do conservation on the ground.
Very, very cool. So when you are looking at like areas that humans have are hanging out in a lot, what are things that we do that are like good, and what are things we do that are bad in terms of like plant management, etc.?
Sure. Well, some of the things that we do that are good are removing weeds that are invasive and taking over. They can really change ecosystems and make it hard for fish or salamanders to survive. A lot of the good things that people do are planting plants that are well adapted to a system. So they're used to the conditions there and they can help keep the soil in place so they can actually make it better for farms in that way. They can also create habitat for lots of creatures, and they can support pollinators like bees that are really important to humans.
Cool. So is there like an area near, let's like, are there different approaches when we're dealing with maybe like your backyard creek that's maybe only, a couple, like a yard or two wide compared to something like a big river? Like, are there different approaches to different sizes of stream?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I think there are. I think the most important thing is that if we're thinking about plants, that we find plants that are well suited to the place where we're planting them. And so they have to work well with whatever we're doing with the land next to it. So if we're in someone's backyard, we want to plant plants that they're going to enjoy having there, that they're going to want to take care of over time. And if we're talking about maybe farmers or people that have animals that are grazing, we need to make sure we plant things that are going to be safe for those animals if they do eat them, for example, or that will work well with whatever crops are being grown right next to it.
Very cool. One of our classrooms says that they have a lake in their backyard. So very cool. If you have any questions at home, please submit them into the Q&A and we'll get those answered right away. So a lot of times we'll have like, so how much of your job are you actually like near bodies of water, like mucking around in the riparian or like next to water environments? And how much of the time are you in a building, in your office, doing that kind of thing?
Well, I suppose I could say I wish I had more time out in the field mucking around. A lot of times I partner with people who are spending more time in the field, and I do visit them in the field, and I actually fly drones to collect pictures. We try to take pictures before and after big planting events, for example, and try to help understand and communicate to other people what are the good things that plants are doing, or where are they having trouble getting plants to survive, and sort of tell that story. So I'd say probably about 10% of my time personally is out in the field. And then most of the rest of the time is working on a computer. But I also do teach a class where I get students out in the field. So when I'm teaching that class, I get a little more time out there.
Awesome. Gavin wants to know, how exactly do plants protect rivers? And are there certain types of plants that work better than others?
Yes, that's a great question. So I'll talk about where I live just because it helps to give an example, I think. So out here, it's pretty dry. And so there are certain plants that can only live right next to streams, either big rivers or small creeks, doesn't really matter. But cottonwood trees, for example, they can only live right along the streams because that's the only place in the landscape where there's enough water all summer long that they can survive. And then those trees, their roots fix the soil. They help stabilize the stream banks so we don't get lots of erosion and collapse, which is generally not what we want to see. They shade the water, and so they help keep the water cool. And out here, that's really important for salmon because people really want the salmon to survive and do well out here, and they need the water to be cold to survive. And many other species do too. So those are a couple of examples. Also, the leaves from the trees will fall into the stream and break down, and they contribute to the food web. So all the little critters that live in the stream will end up eating those leaves, and then other critters will eat them. And that helps actually support the fish too, and just the health of the ecosystem in general. And that all contributes to clean water for humans.
Very cool. So I was reading this book called Eager by Ben Goldfarb, all about beavers. And one of the main things they were talking about in this book is that beavers are or were / are so important for keeping water in our soil. One of the things that the United States or colonizers in the United States have really messed up is killing all the beavers and like trying to over control streams. And then there's less water just like at the surface, which means that there's less water in our soil and in our, I don't know if it's technically the soil or just like in the earth, which downstream prevents us from being able to use it for everything. Our like water tables. And for those at home that don't know what a water table is, it's just like the amount of water in the land that you're living on. And so I know that beavers eat cottonwoods. So is this like, is it all, how do you manage like, okay, we want beavers for keeping the water around and not just tossing it out into the ocean. But they eat the cottonwoods that help keep the streams stable. So like, how do you manage all that? That seems so complicated.
Well, that is really complicated, and that's ecology. That's how ecosystems work. So the tricky part is when humans get involved and we're trying to restore systems. So that's where we're trying to say, okay, we kind of have an idea of how this system used to be naturally and maybe what it could be. And so to get it there, if we want both beavers and cottonwoods, then probably what we would do is plant trees and protect some of them. Because the beavers need some trees, right, to survive and do their thing. And they're ecosystem engineers. They change the whole landscape. So lots of other creatures can live there in addition to returning water to the system and helping us in that way. And so what we can do is try to protect at least some of those trees so that some of them have an opportunity to grow big enough that they'd actually be resistant to beavers, for example. And so it could be a very long process to restore a forest next to a creek where there's nothing but grass there now, for example. And so, you know, from that point of view, we would really try to actively manage the place and try to help create that balance. But it's always a work in progress. And so we try to always adapt. So we study these systems as we're working in them, and we try to work closely with folks that are doing the work so we can try to keep adapting and learning as we go.
Very cool. So I live in Philadelphia, and we just got a beaver back in the Delaware River. And like we've seen, like there's presumably more than just one beaver, but we hadn't seen beavers for years and years and years. And we finally found a beaver around. So we're like very excited about that. I live like less than a mile from the river. So my neighborhood's always talking about river stuff. And so, yeah, they've been eating the cottonwoods. So it's been a balance around here. We don't really know what to do. Okay, next question is from Kelsey. I attend Binghamton University and we have an exploding deer population. Does the abundance of deer affect the way in which plants protect rivers? Because the deer are consuming a lot of those plants.
Yes, it definitely can. And there's sort of a famous example in Yellowstone National Park, if folks are familiar with it. where when humans removed the big carnivores, so when they removed the wolves from the system, then there were too many elk, and the elk ate all the plants next to the stream, and then the stream suffered, the water quality suffered. And then as wolves came back, then it helped discourage the elk from spending so much time next to the stream, not necessarily because they were being eaten, but just because they didn't want to be eaten. So they would behave differently and stay away from the stream. So yeah, there is some evidence that overbrowsing or overgrazing by those kinds of animals can unfortunately negatively impact streams. It also depends what their other food sources are. You know, a lot of times deer make big rounds as they're eating their food. And if they're only eating some of the plants by the stream, then it might just be fine.
Very cool. All right, we've got a question from a fourth grade classroom. If a riparian zone, so the area around water or a stream, gets destroyed by erosion or something else, can plants help it recover?
Yes, absolutely. And there are really lots of spectacular examples out there where people, a lot of times community organizations or even just individuals have gone out and planted plants in those areas. Sometimes if it's kind of an emergency situation, then we might need to put something like a fabric down to keep all the soil from eroding away until the plants grow in. But then once the plants grow in, absolutely, the place can recover in 10 or 20 years. It could be completely transformed.
Awesome. We've got another question. Oh, here we go from Gavin. Can plants be keystone species? And maybe talk about what a keystone species is for folks who don't know what that is.
That's a great question. Yes, keystone species are species that are particularly important in all of the networks of relationships between different kinds of organisms. And so, for example, in the story I was just talking about, you could think of wolves as a keystone species because removing them from the ecosystem in Yellowstone completely changed the whole ecosystem. And so, yes, plants can be, in fact, in some of the systems that I was talking about where we have cottonwood trees, you know, if you have a cottonwood forest in an area and then you remove the cottonwood forest, it completely changes the ecosystem, and all the creatures and plants that lived both on the land and in the water are affected by that change, similar to beavers.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got a question from a fifth grade classroom now. We have a creek in the middle of our Colorado town, and it has cottonwood trees next to it. There are little red fringy things in the creek next to the trees. Are those roots from the cottonwood trees?
Oh, interesting. They could be. There are also lots of tiny organisms that live in association with plant roots. And we're really, as scientists, we're just starting to understand how those work. It's really fascinating. But they actually help interact with what's in the soil and actually help plants uptake their nutrients from the soil. So it's possible that you're seeing some kind of combination of those things. I'm not exactly sure, but a photo would be great.
Cool. Okay, so this is another fourth grade question. Do swans need shade to keep surviving, or can they just have a grassy bank with a pond? I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer to that, but if you do, that's great.
That's a great question. I'm actually not an expert on swans, so I'm not sure, but I bet that's something we could find out pretty easily. I imagine if it's really hot, then sometimes they'd want to be able to cool down.
I bet. Yeah, I don't know a lot about swans either. The thing about being a scientist that I think we don't talk about a lot when you're in school is that we focus on often things that are super specific. So like I know a lot about squid. So you'd think maybe I'd know a lot about octopuses, but I kind of don't. So when people ask me about even as something as similar as octopuses, I'm just like, oh, I'll have to look that up for you. So scientists aren't like super geniuses who know everything. We just know a ton about one thing. So don't be intimidated by science. You don't have to know everything. You just have to know a lot about a thing. And that's pretty manageable if you're thinking about being a scientist. Okie doke. We've got a question. I'm not sure what grade, but it looks like a school. How were rivers created in the first place?
Oh, that's a great question. So the idea is, you know, when rain falls or when snow melts, gravity pulls that water to the lowest places on the landscape. So when a river first forms, let's say Now we're kind of talking a little bit about geology, which is how the Earth's surface changes, right? So let's say there are some mountains pushed up somewhere and it changes where's the lowest place on the ground. Then whenever there's water on the surface, it'll flow to that lowest place. And then as the water moves, it actually carves down into the land because it erodes away and takes material out to the ocean. And so that's how rivers originally form.
Awesome. We've got an interesting question from Nicole. Are there any pesticides that should be avoided when plants are near the stream that are safe or away from a stream? Like, do we have to consider where the runoff from maybe our lawns or whatever gardens are going?
That is an excellent question, and it is a major issue in our country, actually. It's different in different places. But yes, when we have, for example, if we fertilize our lawn and then it rains, all the extra fertilizer will go running over the ground surface and end up going into lakes and streams. And sometimes that causes the algae in the stream, since they use the same nutrients, it helps them to really grow and turn the water green, and that can make the water unhealthy for lots of things that used to live there. So actually, one of the reasons that we plant plants along the stream is because sometimes they can take up some of those extra nutrients before they go into the water, and they can really help to intercept that problem before it affects our water.
Awesome. That's good to know. The next question is from Emma. What originally made you interested in science?
I loved spending time outside, and I was always curious. I think those are the biggest things.
Cool. We've got a question. Okay, so the fifth grade, a different fifth grade class from the other fifth grade class. How long have you worked on this topic?
I started working on this topic in 2016. When I went, I had a different job and I went back to school to get a PhD in environmental and natural resource sciences. And so I studied for about 5 years and I graduated last summer, and now I'm a researcher in that area.
Awesome. We've got a question from Field Biology. In our area, farmers are liable to clean out drainage ditches, getting rid of wooded areas so the water can flow better. These drainage ditches are large streams that are controlled and managed by farms. Should these be left alone, or how could they be managed better?
Oh, that's a great question. There's always a middle ground, and I think there is actually some really interesting research being done about how those kinds of ditches can be changed just a little bit to mimic natural streams, and then they actually naturally clean the water and serve as better habitat. And so one of the ways is just letting them wiggle along instead of being straight lines. That can really make a huge difference in the health of it long term. Also, to create what we call floodplains, so like little benches next to the creek. So when there are high flow events and there's lots of water in there, the water has a place to go that we're happy with it going, not going up over the banks into places where we don't want water. And then it kind of mimics what beavers can do and helps to collect some of the water and let it sink down into the ground.
Awesome. So that your answer perfectly leads into our next question from a fifth grade class in Georgia. What plants or trees help maintain floodplains? And how do they help? So you just answered how floodplains help, because the water goes there and not where we don't want it to go. But are there plants or trees that make floodplains healthier?
Yes, there are many different kinds. I think the number one most important thing, as I mentioned before, is that the plants are adapted to that system that they live in, because every place is different. But they can be shrubs or rushes or sedges or trees. Depending on the place. They need to have roots that will hold the soil in place, and they need to be able to survive flood events, because flooding is a natural part of a river. It's like the river breathing, and it's part of its natural rhythm. And so anything that lives there needs to be able to survive the flood. And the one last thing they do is they make the surface rougher. So think about if you took out all the plants and paved it, and then there was a flood, versus if all the plants are there and then there's a flood. So basically those plants slow down the flood waters and help the water get down into the ground.
Awesome. That's very cool. We've got a question from fourth grade class in Gemini Elementary. Can plants filter out bacteria or germs from the soil?
In some cases they can, but there's a lot we still don't know. And it's really complicated to study things that happen underground because we can't see it. So we try to study that as best we can. And there are scientists called hydrologists that study how water moves through the system, how it moves through the little spaces underground. But there's so much great research that needs to be done in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool work looking at bacteria that are beneficially helping a lot of plants. I once upon a time had a boyfriend that was working on this. He and engineers together were working to basically make like see-through plant soil areas. And so he could watch what was happening by looking at the plants in this like see-through gel instead of putting them in soil. It was pretty cool. So there's a lot of like neat engineering techniques that people are using to study this stuff because yeah, soil, how the heck are you supposed to see what's in there? It's really hard. So scientists are doing their best. Let's see, Anderson wants to know, how can you tell if a tree is dying?
Oh, that's a really good question too. That's one of the things we're really trying to figure out how to do with drone pictures and satellite pictures, is how we can see from above early on when a tree is having a hard time. So one of the things we can do is that trees, or actually the leaves or needles on the tree, they absorb certain types of energy from the sun to make their food, and then they also reflect other types. And so we can use that pattern to try to look at the health of the tree or other plant and figure out if it's showing a healthy signal or a stressed out signal. And if it's showing a stressed out signal, maybe we can do something to help it.
Awesome. We've got a neat question from fourth graders. So the question is, how do you remove algae? Can you tell us like why algae is in sometimes just like totally overtaking places, and then what we can do about it?
Yes, so typically it's too much nitrogen and or phosphorus that's gotten into the water system, mostly from fertilizers that people use on lawns, on golf courses, on farms. Sometimes it's from animal waste and the runoff water that carries that into the system. And it basically it upsets the balance, the natural balance in the water. And so the algae, which are little one-celled plants, it's too much food. So there's too much algae and not enough things to eat the algae. And then it affects how much oxygen is in the water and how much light is getting through the water to other creatures. So it really just kind of upsets that whole balance.
Sounds good. The next question, does it matter how many plants there are to have a healthy ecosystem, both in number and diversity of plants?
That is $1 million question. The answer is it's hard for us to know. I mean, for the most part, we only know what we see or what's been written down by people in the past or what they've taken pictures of. In a lot of cases, it's hard for us to even know what the area would look like naturally before there were people changing it. There's a long history of people changing things on the ground. So usually it's a case of experimenting in one place to just see what works and see how healthy the plants are in different combinations, or we can try to learn from other places with similar settings, but that's something we're trying to figure out all the time.
Sounds good. Agnes, age 8, wants to know, what are some of the best plants to plant for a river area? I know you already mentioned that it kind of depends on where you are, but maybe use where you live in as an example.
Sure. Well, around here, there are plants that we can plant, usually mostly shrubs, and we'd want to choose ones that have flowers at different times of the year, so that in one place, if we have some bees, they have a place to get food throughout the growing season, for example. We also want to plant plants that we know will survive because it gets very dry here in the summer. So we have certain shrubs like golden currants or wild rose, or dogwood shrubs that if they're planted in the right place, close enough to the stream, they can survive without people really taking care of them after the first season or two. And so again, different places will have different best choices, but we want to think about what animals are we trying to help, and what will probably survive and do well, and what will people enjoy seeing, because usually that's helpful too.
For sure. Yeah. Related, so Bridges Montessori Elementary 2 wants to know, so you mentioned that where you live is dry. What state are you in?
I'm in Washington State. So Washington goes all the way to the Pacific coast, but I'm on the very, very eastern edge of Washington State. And here we're on the range, we're in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. And so it is actually very dry. We call it semi-arid. So it rains a lot in the winter time and then in the spring, but then from about May to September, we get almost no rain. And so we here need to find plants that will do well with almost no rain for many months.
Wow. I always think of Washington as being so wet because I'm always thinking of the West Coast, but it's such a big state. Okay, so the next question is another one from fourth graders. We have a lot of different groups of fourth graders here. I wonder if like fourth graders are learning about riparian environments. I don't know, but I'm glad you're all here. The next question is, can fish help bodies of water?
Oh, definitely they can. There is a lot that fish do throughout their life cycle. Again, it depends on the actual fish, but they play an important role in the food web. So they eat all the little bugs that live in the water or bugs that fall into the water sometimes from plants that are nearby. And to talk about salmon again, just because it's something we think about a lot out here in the Northwest, salmon actually build nests for their eggs. They get in the bottom and they kind of swish around and they build a nest of rocks to protect their eggs and let the water, nice clear water, flow through those nests. Well, while they're doing that, they're actually stirring up the river bottom and getting some of the little tiny mud pieces out, and kind of cleaning up and changing the shape of the river. And so everything else that lives with them is used to that. And so that becomes an important part of the ecosystem.
Awesome. Here's a neat question from Angus. Could we use the plants surrounding bodies of water in water treatment systems as an aid to filtration of wastewater?
Yes, and actually that happens quite a bit particularly in farm areas where people will put special, they call them filter strips, where they plant certain grasses right next to the water. And those grasses, the whole purpose of them is to help clean and filter the water, not necessarily wastewater from people, but the water that's flowing off the farm and try to make it cleaner.
Awesome. Liam wants to know, is it bad to have a lot of buildings near plants, or will the plants be fine whether they're near buildings or not?
Well, that's a great question. Lots of plants would be fine to be close to buildings. The biggest thing you need to worry about is if the buildings shade them too much and they don't get the amount of sun that they need. But it seems like there's always another kind of plant you could find that would do well in that situation.
Cool. We've got another fourth grader question. Do fish eat mosquito eggs?
I think if they can get them, I think that they would. It depends on the situation, of course.
A lot of things eat mosquito eggs, eat mosquito adults. Yeah, mosquitoes are one of those animals that are on the menu for a wild number of things. And I am 100% sure that fish eat mosquito eggs. Or not all of them, but some of them that are small, and therefore that's an enjoyable snack. Like a big old like a big fish is going to be like, that's like a crumb of a potato chip. I'm not going to eat that. But the little fish are like, great, that's a hamburger for me. So that's great. The more mosquitoes that get eaten, the better, in my opinion. Okay, so Mia wants to know, can fish kill or poison the water?
Not usually. Sometimes there are fish that people add to the water because people like to go fishing in certain places. And sometimes they can upset the natural balance of fish in the ecosystem because they eat a lot of the food that the fish that were already there would have liked to eat.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I can't think of a way off the top of my head that fish would be bad for the water.
Sounds good. We've got a seventh grader question. Do plants in the water affect the ocean in a bad or a good way?
Usually, I would say they affect the ocean in a good way because the best thing is if we have clean water going out to the ocean. And so if the plants help make the water cleaner, and if the ecosystem in the river is in a healthier situation, then it's going to be healthier going into the ocean. And really, we give these ecosystems different names, and we might call this a river and that the ocean. But to a fish like a salmon who swims back and forth and spends part of its life in both, they're all part of the same thing.
Totally. Yeah, that's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about like the way other animals perceive the world and how plants perceive the world compared to how we perceive the world. Like we put everything on a map and we want to put things into boxes, and nature doesn't always see the boxes that we see. So when you're becoming a scientist, kind of like being able to learn what you have to learn, but then break your mind out of human trappings is helpful. So thanks for bringing that up. The next question is from Deborah. How do fish like salmon, like we've talked about quite a bit, how do they get up those high currents up the stream?
They are incredibly strong and coordinated, and they spend a bunch of time, at least in the case of salmon, they spend years in the ocean eating lots of food and saving up their energy and getting really strong and lots of muscles with all the energy. And they just swim up those currents. It's pretty amazing.
They're tough. They're very, very impressive. The next question is from field biology. When you are approaching a stream and you want to assess the stream's health, what do you do to figure that out?
Well, that's a great question. Well, in some ways we can observe, so we can look at what plants are there. We can look at the shape of the stream channel. For example, some streams where they've been straightened by people, the stream cuts down into the ground, and we can see a very obvious shape where the sides are very steep and it seems lower than it should be. Things like that show us something about the health. And then we can collect samples of the water, of the bugs living in the water, all sorts of things like that to figure out how healthy the stream is.
Very cool. A judge wants to know, are there animals that filter water?
Yes, to some degree, there are tiny little animals that live in the water that do help to clean the water in some cases, and also bacteria. So one of the things that rivers do is they tend to churn up the water because it's moving, it has to flow over rocks, and it kind of gets air in it. And that with that air, the bacteria can help to clean the water. And that's really what happens in water treatment plants too.
Very cool. This is from Shanarat. What plants grow the fastest?
Oh, that's a good question. Depends where you are. Around here, we have willows that can grow very quickly, willow trees or willow shrubs, and also pine trees out here for the kinds of things that we have. They grow very quickly. I guess it depends on how quickly you're talking about. If you want something to grow in one growing season, think about a sunflower. If you want something to grow quickly over 10 years, then you would think about willow trees or something like that.
Awesome. We've got a very timely question from this 4th grade classroom. What are you going to do? Do you have any like specific plans this year for Earth Day?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, actually, I'm involved with the green team at my kids' elementary school, and so I'm going to work with them and their student council to do some cleanup around the school and some other kind of awareness event that we haven't quite worked out yet.
Awesome. Lisa from 5th grade wants to know, are bugs good for the health of the creek?
Bugs are essential. They are very important for the health of the creek because they provide the food for everything that's higher up on the food web, like fish.
Awesome. And we've got not more of a, am I frozen? I'm frozen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, then great. Then just my screen's frozen. I'm going to keep going. We've got Nicole, a 4th grade teacher, who's coming in with a helpful comment about the fish mosquito question. We just looked it up and read that some of the best fish for mosquito control are goldfish, guppies, bass, bluegill, and catfish. But the best is the mosquito fish, Gambusia affinans. They eat the larvae before they can turn into adults. Very cool.
Very cool.
don't release goldfish into the stream. That is a bad call. Goldfish living where they naturally live are awesome. But if you have a pet goldfish and you don't want it anymore, do not release it into the stream. That is bad news. Bad news. All right. So this is another one from fourth graders. Did all water sources start out healthy at the beginning?
That's a great question. I would say we usually, as ecologists, we would assume that yes, before people started changing things on the land, that probably, yes, they were all healthy in the beginning.
Very cool. The next question is, do fish know if something is poisonous? Like, how does the fish know what to eat and what not to eat?
That's a great question. I think they have senses kind of like people do when they're in the water, and certain things they know how to tell the difference between. Unfortunately, when there are tiny pieces of plastic, for example, they may not be able to tell the difference between that and food, and they might eat it. So that's kind of a sad thing.
Yeah, plastics are a big one for just like, it looks like food, so they eat it. That's also true for albatrosses and other ocean animals. The next question is from a judge again. This is a fun question. Do houseplants live longer than plants near streams?
Oh, well, I'd say it depends on the plant, because we have some plants that could live next to streams for hundreds of years, and probably longer than a houseplant.
Probably longer, especially thinking about who takes care of the houseplant. Some houseplants last 2 weeks under my dad's care, and others last years when I'm taking care of them, or sometimes not. The next question is from Ryan. In what ways does the use of pesticides on invasive plants cause impacts on water life, including pH and composition of the water?
Great questions. Yes, pesticides are not healthy for the water ecosystem. And so most, the government generally in many places will regulate where it's okay to use those on the ground, and usually not near water if it can be helped. The effects depend on what the chemical is that's being used. So it's hard to say exactly how it's going to change the water. But sometimes with those pesticides, very tiny amounts can get into an animal's body and send a confusing signal to the animal's body and change the way that it works. So even small amounts, even if we couldn't tell that change by sampling the water, we might see it in how those animals reproduce.
For sure. Awesome. The next question, how do you get rid of invasive plants?
There are lots of different strategies. Probably the safest one usually is for people to take them out of the ground. So whether it's doing that by hand with tools or sometimes with heavy equipment like a backhoe, usually that's kind of the safest way to do it. Sometimes people burn areas very carefully to get a fresh start in that place, or sometimes they do use herbicides if they need to, and then they're very careful with them.
Cool. The next question is from a fourth grade class in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Ooh, is it safe for us to plant plants near the river, or should we let nature do it on its own? Are there some plants that are always safe to plant?
That's a great question. And I'd say, especially for kids, you should always be careful next to a river, and you should always be careful when using tools, and make sure you have grown-ups with you. I'd say that sometimes if we try to let nature do its own thing, it doesn't actually get a chance to do that, because things people are doing are changing the climate and the air and the situation that the plants need to survive. And a lot of it is just people moving around and taking boats, for example, from one place to the next, or things stick to our shoes and we walk from one place to the next. So we bring invasive species to different places, and then it's hard for nature to actually catch up and recover in that place. So if we want to see it recover, sometimes we have to get in there and get those invasive species out, and then nature can recover.
Awesome. The final question that we have time for today from the audience comes from Lisa. Seth would like to know, what can humans do to help promote a positive environment for our rivers?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think one of the best things is just spend time by your river, get to know it, watch it in the different seasons, see what happens when it rains a lot. And just pay attention to the different kind of creatures that are there. I think people love spending time near rivers usually, and it's a really healthy thing for everybody to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So we always ask everybody the same 2 questions at the end of each of these sessions. The first question is, if you had the attention of everybody in the world and you could tell them one thing about rivers and streams, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that rivers and streams are the arteries and veins of our ecosystem. So we need to take good care of them.
Sounds good. Solid pieces of information. The next question is, you still have everybody's attention in the whole world, and you can tell them one thing about literally anything. It can be as big picture important or silly and insignificant as you'd like. What do you tell them?
That's a big question to try to answer. I think one thing that everyone in the world has in common is that we all need clean air and clean water. So let's take care of each other and take care of our planet.
Solid. Awesome. Very good. Very appropriate for Earth Week and every week, because we're on Earth every week, not just during April. Okay, so is there anywhere you'd like to plug, anything you'd like us to know about, anywhere we can find you on social media, etc.?
I am on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to find me, Amanda T. Stahl. As far as other resources, I don't have any off the top of my head that I would definitely recommend, but there are so many good organizations that provide information about rivers. AmericanRivers.org is a great one, but there are many more out there. Very cool. Very cool. I just as you were answering the question, I realized there's a praying mantis on my coffee cup. It's a baby. It just hatched yesterday. I'm just going to show you all really, really quick because we have the opportunity, so why not? There you go. Oop. When they're babies, they jump, and it is so silly. Okay. Whoop. You see him? Whoop. Well, that's a baby praying mantis. They are very jumpy and silly, and I have like 100 of them in my house right now, and I tried putting them in a cage and it's not working out. They are figuring ways to get out. Now they're all over my office. Okay. Anyway, I hope to see you all tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern, for a talk all about cougars and corridors, how animals get around when humans get in their way, basically. Talking with Paul Byer. Amanda, thank you so much for sharing all this information with us. This was so cool. This session will be posted on YouTube later today at youtube.com/SkypeAScientist. And if you enjoy the sessions that we provide here at Skype a Scientist, you can support our program at patreon.com/SkypeAScientist. I hope you all had fun and learned a lot. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you. And thanks everyone for signing. You're the best.